Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a Ukraine war news update, I suppose, breaking in some respects with regard to some of the things people are saying about the halting of US aid, military aid to Ukraine. This is becoming a little bit more controversial, and it is possibly a sign of more worrying movements from the Trump administration. Let's try and get a grip as to what is happening here, what the reactions are from all sorts of different people, and see whether this is something to be properly worried about. Okay, so first of all, Ukrainians, and you should know by now that the US has said they're putting a halt to a certain number of weapons, and we'll look at exactly what weapons they are in a short while, to Ukraine, including, I think, stopping them at Poland. They are at the moment stocked up in Poland, ready to go to Ukraine, and like, nope, you can't send them. So major casualties among civilians. US freeze on air defense missiles is terrible news for Ukraine, says the Kyiv Independent. Trump's latest move emboldens Russia's recent deadly drone and missile campaign on Ukrainian civilian areas. So this is in the context of a real uptick in Russian attacks, including ballistic missiles and obviously Shahid drones on Ukraine. 16 times what it was a year ago. And at this particular moment, that's when the US say, no, we're not going to supply some PAC-3 Patriot missiles. We're not going to supply a number of other air defense capabilities to you. So the aid in question included several pieces of US weaponry that had been critical to Ukraine's ability to conduct the war. Nick Schifrin, a reporter for PBS NewsHour, wrote on X that the halt included PAC-3 Patriots, 155mm artillery round, Gimlers, so HIMARS missiles, a Stinger, AIM-7 and Hellfire missiles. While the economics of losing such systems hurts the Ukrainians' war effort, Ukraine's military has managed to build its own equivalent to several of those since the war's outset. The critical exception is air defense. Quote, cutting off delivery of missiles for Patriot anti-air systems will mean a weaker air defense system over the country, and as a result, destruction of civilian infrastructure and major casualties among civilians. Alexei, a deputy commander who coordinates mobile air defense groups in Kyiv Oblast, told the Kyiv Independent. In other words, this kind of halting of weapons is going to lead to Ukrainian deaths. That's a Ukrainian response there. Now, Kyiv Independent also reports that European partners have reportedly been caught off guard as the US has halted these arms shipments to Ukraine. According to Bloomberg, several European allies hope the Trump administration will soften or reverse the decision, so it wasn't really expected. In fact, Mark Rutte, the Secretary General for NATO, was interviewed on Fox News today, and I presume he wasn't expecting to have to answer questions about this because he wasn't really something he initially knew about, but this was his response.
How do you feel about the report today that the U.S. is stopping shipments of Patriots and some artillery because they say we're running short of it for our own arsenal? Have you heard about that directly from the president and from the Secretary of Defense, or are you just reading about it like I am?
No, these reports are really new, and I totally understand that the U.S. always has to make sure that their own interests are covered, but...
That first part of the answer, I mean, the problem is that these aren't things, as far as I can work out, the US is particularly needing desperately at the moment. So that appears to be unsatisfactory as rationale for holding these back. And if that's the case, then the question is, well, why is the US holding these back? More on that in a sec.
When it comes to Ukraine, in the short term, Ukraine cannot do without all the support it can get when it gets to ammunition and to air defense systems. And last week, the President and President Zelensky had a very good discussion, particularly focusing on air defense systems. So, yes, I understand the US has to take care of its stockpiles, and at the same time, we have to allow for some flexibility here.
How do you feel about the report today?
That's Mark Rutte's response. There's been a response from a number of Republicans that has been really critical of this, as well as obviously Democrats. Brian Fitzpatrick, who has been out to Ukraine, he's a Republican representative, said, "I will be aggressively looking into this matter and will be demanding accountability. We must build up our own defense industrial base here in the US while simultaneously providing the needed assistance to our allies who are defending their freedom from brutal invading dictators. To not do both is unacceptable." So he's like, well, we can do both. We can have our own stockpiles high and provide weaponry for Ukraine. I mean, the 155 mil rounds, they are not manufacturing them at the rates that they were expected to. And under the Biden administration, they ramped those up, but they seem to have not continued to ramp those up so much under Trump. And so I think they're making 50,000 a month at the moment, but they were looking to get, they're looking to get to 80,000, 100,000, I think, a month at one stage. And that's, I don't know, it doesn't seem to be so much on the cards at the moment. So, and the question then is, well, why is that? What's going on there? So according to well-placed US military sources, the Pentagon has halted weapon systems needed by Ukraine at a crucial moment in its fight with Russia. The weapons, which were already on their way to Ukraine and in Poland, include missile interceptors, 155mm ammunition cells. One official source said there was some concern at the Pentagon about US missile interceptor stockpiles running low. So that's one of the sources. Brian Fitzpatrick, who said, look, I'm going to look into this, has actually put together a letter that he sent to Trump, copied into Pete Hegseth and I think Marco Rubio. And it's a pretty robust letter. You can go and check that out. I'm not going to read that out now, but he's particularly worried about this, the situation. And he's requested an emergency briefing from the White House and Department of Defense with regard to this. So that's really good news that Brian Fitzpatrick has done that. Mr. President, part of it says Ukrainian soldiers and pilots are not just defending their homeland, they are holding the line for the entire democratic world. There can be no half measures in the defense of liberty. So yeah, definitely not happy that the aid has been halted. And then, absolutely incredibly, a Jake Sullivan article has come out. The tragedy of halting weapons to Ukraine. When you are seeing an article from Jake Sullivan about there not being enough weapons going to Ukraine, you know you're doing something wrong, because he was obviously criticized roundly by many for not giving enough weapons to Ukraine out of escalation management theorizing. But he has now sought to criticize the administration for holding back this weaponry, and rightly so, of course. Now, James Rubb says the US has no use for AIM-7. The decision was made to destroy Ukraine. So, if you think the US is desperate for all of these missiles and all of this artillery ammunition, I think you're being rather gullible, because I'm pretty sure this isn't going to change the US's ability to conduct war. I mean, what have we got here? Here's a list of US munitions approved for Ukraine but now being held in Poland. This is what's in Poland that they're not allowing. 92 AIM missiles, 30 Patriot missiles, PAC-3 MSE. So they shoot down ballistic missiles. 8,496 155mm howitzer rounds. 142 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles. 252 Gimler's missiles. 25 Stinger missiles. 125 AT-4 grenade launchers. So if you think like, oh, we're worried about stockpiles, 25 Stinger missiles. Why would you do that? And the only reason you'd do that, I could see, is that it's not about your own stockpiles. It's about something else. The US sent 300 Hellfires to Israel last month, but now the stockpiles are low. So there you go. So Israel definitely prioritized above Ukraine. That's for sure. Thomas Tyner says the numbers here below are between 1% and... I'm not sure, is that 0.1% he's trying to say, and 1% of the annual US production for weapons. Maybe it's 1 and 2%, I don't know, but very small percentage of the annual US production for these weapons. For the example, he gives 252 Gimler's missiles. The production in 2025 was 14,000 of those missiles. For the 8,496 155 mil rounds, the production in 2025 should be 500,000 plus. The cheese, that's Elbridge Colby, and he's called the cheese. People are starting to call him that more openly because they know he doesn't like that name, apparently. Elbridge Colby is like, I don't like that name. Adam Kinzinger was saying, now you know this, everyone needs to call him the cheese. So anyway, Elbridge Colby, who is the Deputy for Defence for Policy, and he's thought to be the person behind this. Now, he is not a fan of Ukraine, and he is long sought for US to pivot away from Ukraine. This was even before Trump got in. He was being tapped up for a position that he's got now, and he's long been advocating for pivoting away from Ukraine and towards Taiwan. He's a massive China hawk, but he's, by all accounts, quite simplistic in his understanding of the geopolitical situation, and he's being blamed for this. So as Thomas Steiner says, the cheese, Elbridge Colby, lies when he says the US needs those. Now, who is Elbridge Colby? So Yoni Eskola helps us out. He's one of Russia's best allies in Washington. He's a traitor to the US and an enemy of Ukraine. He must be remembered as a man who helped Russia kill more Ukrainian civilians than the Trump administration for enabling him. Elbridge Colby is not just a Nepo baby or a Twitter contrarian. He's been on Twitter and sounding off for some time, right? He is now directly responsible for the deaths of Ukrainian civilians. As Trump's Pentagon policy chief, he halted shipments of already promised aid right as Russia launched its biggest strikes of the war. This isn't just about stockpiles. The missiles being withheld include AIM-7 Sparrows, which the US doesn't even actively need. Colby is on a personal crusade against Ukraine, and his long-standing disdain for Ukrainian sovereignty is now becoming US policy. He's not just cutting future aid, he's cancelling past aid, weapons already promised under the Biden administration. While Ukrainian cities burn, Colby is making sure that they don't get the tools to defend themselves. He is one of Russia's best allies in Washington. Elbridge Colby thinks NATO is CIA funded, and he blocked Sparrow missiles Ukraine urgently needs, missiles the US and Israel don't even need. So those AIM-7 Sparrows that get sent in, they get used in these Frankenstein, the book launchers that can fire those missiles. I think that's the ones that they are. They're not even used by Israel, so you can't even see Israel is prioritized above Ukraine, so we need to get these weapons to Israel. Neither of the countries use them. Why would you stop Ukraine getting those? People this dumb and malicious shouldn't shape policy, but he does. Colby's hatred for Ukraine makes him useful to Trump and Putin. So here he's arguing against Adam Kinzinger and slagging off NATO, etc., etc. Elbridge Colby must be remembered for what he is, the man who helped Russia kill more Ukrainian civilians. This is not a policy debate. This is complicity in mass death, and the Trump administration is letting him lead the way. And now that the US is doing what we feared from a traitorous Trump, says Eskola administration, Europe must finally step up, order SAMP-T batteries, order Aster interceptors. Ukraine can't rely on Patriot systems in the long run. This war will last years. Ukraine needs air defense now. So that's a really critical look at Elbridge Colby. But there are some claims, like Michael Weiss has just come out as a journalist and says, hilarious, Elbridge Colby's staff are now telling reporters it wasn't his memo. Leave him alone. When your name sounds suspiciously like that of a depressive John Cheever character, you should know it doesn't end well for you. And there's a Politico article, Republicans tear into Pentagon's Ukraine weapons freeze. We're going to join it a little bit down here. Some top lawmakers, and this is already talked about, people like Michael McCall and indeed Brian Fitzpatrick and what they've said on the matter. But some top lawmakers weren't ready to pin the blame on Trump himself. Rather, they singled out senior Pentagon officials who have been skeptics of further aid to Ukraine. Senator Jean Shaheen, Democrat from New Hampshire, the top Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, called out Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Pentagon Policy Chief Elbridge Colby, a longtime proponent of shifting US military resources away from Ukraine in order to beef up Taiwan's defenses. She argued the pause undermines Trump's commitments to NATO at NATO and urged Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is simultaneously serving as White House National Security Advisor, to enforce a strategy. Quote, the Trump administration's mixed messaging is undermining its own agenda to bring Putin to the negotiating table, and this move under Secretary Hegseth's leadership will only make a just and lasting peace harder to obtain, Shaheen said in the statement. Now is not the time for rogue actors undermining our national security interests. Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat from Connecticut, said he is a senior Senate Armed Services Committee member. He called the rationale behind the freeze fallacious and maybe even disingenuous. He said he and colleagues in both parties were surprised by the news and that Ukrainians will suffer. Quote, they're going to lose more lives, more people will be maimed and injured, more homes, hospitals, schools will be destroyed, he said in an interview. The Russians are not even making a pretense of going after military targets. So on and so forth. It's not looking good, is it? Now, Wall Street Journal has released a piece. The US halts key weapons for Ukraine in a new sign of weakening support for Kyiv. Withholding Patriot air defense missiles comes as the Ukraine faces persistent Russian air attacks. And it doesn't look like it's a case of the US needing the stockpiles. The US is proposing to supply Ukraine with significantly less weaponry, only enough to, quote, bring the war to a conclusion. So the Wall Street Journal is proposing that the US is scaling down aid to Ukraine essentially to force it to the negotiating table, which is one of the options that Trump said he would apply if Ukraine didn't toe the party line. If Ukraine dragged their feet in doing whatever was necessary to get to the negotiating table, then Trump said, I will starve them of weaponry. Which is what he appears to be doing now, or his administration appears to be doing now. But Ukraine have done everything that the US has asked them to do. It's Russia that's not doing anything that they've been asked to do. And they are having, as we're going to see in a bit, sanctions lifted. So it's an incredible situation where Trump very clearly said, before he became president, I will solve this in 24 hours. And one of the things I will do is I will say, if you don't come to the negotiating table to Russia, I'm going to hit you. I will give as many weapons to Ukraine as they'll possibly need. And, we can sanction you to the hilt, right? That has happened. Russia hasn't done what they've asked. And instead of we'll give Ukraine all the weapons we possibly can, it's we're going to not give Ukraine weapons, all the weapons we possibly can. We're going to try and give them no weapons. And we're not going to sanction you. In fact, we're going to lift or not enforce already existing sanctions. Ukraine does everything and they are punished for doing everything. So it's just unconscionable. At the time, deliveries were paused, says Null reports. Over 20 PAC-3 Patriot missiles and more than 20 Stinger systems, Hellfire missiles, and over 90 AIM missiles were being stored in Poland. So the US has suspended the transfer of weapons to Ukraine that were already in Poland, and they noted that it's not about a complete cessation of aid to Ukraine. Trump will be offered support options that are consistent with his goal of ending the war. So we're going to see what that is from, I think, Tammy Bruce, the spokesperson for the Secretary of State. We're going to see what she has to say. Before we get there, it's also worth noting that Bridget Brink, who's a former ambassador to Ukraine for the US, has come out strongly against this. US-made air defense systems protected me and my team from Russia's nightly missile and drone attacks. The Trump administration's halting shipments of critical defense missiles won't end Russia's war. It will result in more civilians and children killed. End of. So Zelensky's come out and said, currently at the working levels between Ukraine and the United States, all the details of the supply of defense support are being clarified, including the air defense component. One way or another, we must ensure protection of our people. In other words, holy crap, we're trying to work out what the hell's going on. Right, a couple of statements now from Tammy Bruce, the US State Department spokesperson. Let's see what she has to say.
I wanted to ask about, I understand the decision on which weapons to provide to Ukraine being one taken at the Pentagon, but from a diplomacy standpoint, does pausing the weapon deliveries for Ukraine make it more difficult to get Russia to come to the table in terms of a peace agreement or a ceasefire because it somehow relieves potential pressure on them?
It's a very good question, but it's good that it's not going to be a factor because we haven't paused sending weapons to Ukraine. This is one aspect, one situation, one event that has been changed. As you heard from the DoD, there are multiple robust other options and efforts regarding the Ukrainian situation with weapons. Again, I don't speak for the DoD. I can only refer to their statement and to what they've stated very bluntly.
So just to translate what she said, because essentially that's word salad. She said, we're not halting all weapons. This is just one area. And there are plenty of other options, but yada, yada, yada. So as far as I can work out, that's like, yeah, we can try other things. I mean, you could interpret this as being really bad. That it's like, yeah, we're going to halt weapons, but we've got other options like, you know, forcing them to negotiating table, trying to, you know, do the diplomatic angle or whatever. I mean, that sounds like stopping aid or some aid to force them to the table. But it could just be that, hey, we stopped these weapons, but we're giving other weapons. And, you know, there are multiple options and different angles of this. But it doesn't answer the question, well, why have you stopped these weapons? I mean, she does talk about an America First policy, but these weapons are not needed for an America First policy.
The President has also indicated his remaining commitment regarding Patriot missiles. This is not, I will reinforce this is not a cessation of us assisting Ukraine or of providing weapons. This is one event in one situation, and we'll discuss what else comes up in the future, but be wary of painting too broad a brush there. All right.
Which, you know, that's somewhat less than disastrous. As in, if she can be taken at her word, okay, we've got some missiles here, but it's just one thing. Don't see that as representative as to what the US is doing across the board with military aid to Ukraine. But still, well, why? What is it representative of? Like, what is going on here? It's not cool. Okay, and then there's another question that she's asked and that she answers.
But the president from the get-go made it clear that his American first foreign policy objective when it comes to Russia-Ukraine war is to end the killing. And these are defensive weapons, and Ukraine needs that for that very reason, to end the killing of Ukrainians by the Russians. How do you square the circle?
How do you square the circle that Trump said he wants to end the killing, and these are defensive weapons, air defense weapons, to stop the killing of Ukrainian civilians? How do you square the circle?
Well, it's not, one doesn't need to complete the circle or square it. Our commitment hasn't changed. The nature of how we're able to make that commitment is going to be based on what is best for America first. It is the president's point of view, his guiding hand about the nature of what needs to occur. And it is certainly two nations at war. And America has made a huge difference in that regard. And the president still has worked to have people at the table, that this can only be solved diplomatically. That, of course, is the State Department's wheelhouse. And that's what he wants. He has made several remarks returning to this now with the Israel-Iran situation at least managed. And this is not something that the president is not addressing. It is clearly on our plate all the time. Certainly, he has specifically referred to the nature of the continued slaughter. It is unacceptable. It is a horrible dynamic, the targeting of civilian areas. The world knows this. This has been something that's been discussed. The president has expressed his fury over this issue, and that has not changed. So
blah, 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 America first, blah, 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 blah. Deaths are bad. Doesn't really answer why this is happening. Michael Wise says, read the whole thread and note the good Colby, that's Colby Badwar, not Elbridge Colby, who painstakingly reads all the Pentagon and security assistance literature, draws the following conclusion. Quote, this is all beyond Hegseth's comprehension, though, whereas Bridge and Vought are malicious actors deliberately sabotaging both Ukraine and the entire Department of Defense under false pretenses. This isn't about the US's own readiness, it's about harming Ukraine. So we're going to listen, we're going to read this Colby Badwar thread here. And yeah, people like Russell Vought these are evil people. Pete Hegseth is just deeply underqualified for his job as Secretary of Defense. I mean, my goodness, I'm sure history will look very poorly upon him as just being, unfit for the job. But it's not to say he's necessarily malicious concerning Ukraine. Actually, he said broadly positive things about Ukraine. In fact, he was critical of the Biden administration not giving enough before he, while he was at Fox News. And then the tables turned when he became the Secretary of Defense, and now he seems to be doing the bidding of some of these other more nefarious actors. Yesterday, Politico broke that the Pentagon paused some shipments of ammo to Ukraine, says Badwa. The decision, driven by the Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, that's Elbridge Colby, is claimed by the Department of Defense to be in response to concerns about their own stockpiles. Is that true? No, it's not. So, Department of Defense stocks of a wide variety of munitions are undoubtedly depleted due to the war in Ukraine and the conflict in the Middle East. But the devil is always in the details. Politico reports that the pause has impacted both deliveries under PDA and USAI. So that's the presidential drawdown stocks from US stockpiles being sent to Ukraine. So stuff they've got ready to go. And then USAI funding is the funding for ordering stuff from manufacturers. So both of those, the pause has impacted on both of those. Now, PDA, Presidential Drawdown Authority, is the mechanism for delivery of defense articles to Ukraine from DoD stocks. USAI, Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, allows for the procurement of defense articles from industry at all partner countries. Deliveries from past drawdowns authorized by the Biden administration have long been expected to conclude this summer. Secretary of Defense Hegseth recently stated that they are currently executing on PDAs 71 to 74, implying that previous PDA execute orders have been completed. Deliveries from USAI, so funding for manufacturers to produce these, if allowed to proceed unmolested, would continue for years to come. As of December, there was still $10 billion in committed funding that was still not obligated, put on contract. I'd be surprised if this has substantially changed since then. And you can see up there, USAI obligations, 21.2 billion, appropriated 32.7 billion. So, obligated 1, committed, and remaining. I'm not quite sure how that all works out. Anyway, to continue, we now come to what specific munitions have been held up due to those supposed concerns about the DoD's own depleted inventory levels. The weapons are sitting in Poland, and NPR has acquired an exact list of what's being held back. As we know, 92 AIM-7 Sparrow missiles, 30 PAC-3 MSEs, 8,496 155mm, 142 AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, 252 Gimlers, 25 Stingers, 125 AT recoilless anti-tank guns. Okay, this is a very modest list of ammunition, nothing that is going to comprise the DoD's own readiness. AIM-7 in particular is scarcely used by US fighter aircraft, if at all. MSE was not included in PDAs 71 to 74, meaning it's coming via USAI and not US stocks. So these are stuff that have been ordered, bought and paid for. Hellfire, which was not previously known to be provided to Ukraine by the US, has not been procured since 2023 to 2024 due to inventory requirements being met. In other words, the US has enough of them. The only item on the list that is likely having an impact on inventory requirements are the 252 Gimlers. So these are the rockets or the missiles used in the HIMARS, for example, or the M240s. Is that right? Gimlers is interesting because there have been anecdotes from Ukraine observing a recent increase in Gimlers fire missions. This is likely due to the first lot of contracted Gimlers via USAI being delivered this year. The first lot, financial year 23, is scheduled to conclude next month. And there's a picture for your delectation. With Lockheed Martin producing 14,000 Gimlets per year, the US Army can afford to give up 250 more from their inventory now, assuming that all of them are from inventory and not a mix of both PDA and new production from USAI. The decision is just another example of Trump administration officials actively working against the president's own agenda. At the NATO summit, he pledged to work on sourcing additional Patriot assets for Ukraine and scored a big win with the alliance adopting the 5% target. Any delay to the delivery of what has previously been promised to Ukraine is going to impact confidence in the United States as a supplier of arms to allies and partners. With the OMB sabotaging Trump's desire to see a strong military, the US needs those arms sales badly. This is all beyond Hegseth's comprehension, though. Whereas Bridge and Vought are malicious actors, deliberate. So Russell Vought, for example, is one of the main Project 2025 authors, and he's behind the scenes in the White House, and Bridge too, deliberately sabotaging both Ukraine and the entire Department of Defense under false pretenses. This isn't about the US's own readiness, it's about harming Ukraine. And yeah, that's Elbridge there, which is, you know, who he calls Bridge. I presume that's what he means by Bridge. And then you have Russell Vought there. So there is no evidence that the Trump admin has committed any of the $5.2 billion in PDA replacement funding that remained as of December. That's even more than I thought. The Pentagon controller has only published one technical correction to previous reprogramming actions since January the 20th. So there, that is. If there's such concern about the department giving too much ammo to Ukraine, why are they not using the $5 billion sitting on the shelf to fix that problem? Moreover, why haven't they asked for more money? So there is money there to procure this stuff. There's absolutely no need to halt deliveries to Ukraine from any angle at all, which is why this is worse than we might think. The chances are this is ideological and not functional. It's not practical. It's not needed. It's not a case that the US really does have low stockpiles of these munitions and needs to stop them going from Ukraine for their own safety. It's just not the case. The DoD is actually tens of billions of dollars in the hole on Ukraine replacement requirements. The Biden administration never requested enough money for that purpose. So even if the Trump administration doesn't send one new bullet, they need to ask Congress for more money. But again, the civilian leadership at the DoD doesn't care about this. They aren't interested in fixing the actual problems. They are only making things worse for themselves, Ukraine, and all of the US's other allies. We can only hope that Bridge and Hegseth are overruled. End of thread. Jimmy Rushton, security analyst, says someone close to Donald Trump should explain in very, very simple terms that helping Russia kill more Ukrainians is not going to get him his Nobel Peace Prize. And then we're just going to briefly go on to, so you have the US holding back weapons to Ukraine. What's the other component to pressure on Russia? Sanctions. So what's going on there? Well, we heard the other day that due to nuclear needs in Europe, the US lifts several sanctions on Russia tied to civil nuclear energy. A new Treasury license issued June the 27th allows transactions with major Russian banks, including Gazprom Bank, Sberbank, and VTB, to support foreign nuclear projects started before November 2024. Hungary's 12 billion PAX-2 plant with Rosatom is expected to benefit directly. So they have lifted sanctions on Russia to enable Russia to export more nuclear services. So that could be seen as highly controversial. In fact, Anne Applebaum says Trump is slowly, quietly lifting sanctions on Russia and halting previously allocated munitions too. Without an announcement, US policy is beginning to favour not a ceasefire, but Russian success. And there is a New York Times article to go with that. Joe Walsh, former Republican, said because Trump is on Putin's side, because Trump works for Putin. Sometimes you can't disagree with that. Did Trump just lift sanctions on Russia? So then there's news today, but I do want to put a corrective here. There was, and I did this in my YouTube short earlier. There's news circulating that there are more sanctions that have been lifted. And by the way, there have been lifting of sanctions, and there have been reports of the US not bothering to enforce sanctions, which is functionally the same as lifting sanctions. If you're going to put sanctions on but not be bothered to enforce them, then they're as good as not existing. So did Trump just lift sanctions on Russia? Ukraine responds. So basically, because of an executive order concerning lifting sanctions on Syria, a bunch of sanctions on Russia have been lifted. So here RBC reports that by lifting sanctions against Syria, US President Donald Trump removed some Russian companies, banks and individuals from under certain restrictions. However, they were removed only from the so-called Syrian sanctions regime, according to a post by Vladislav Vlasiuk, an advisor to the Presidential Commissioner for Sanctions Policy, and a statement by a member of Ukrainian Parliament, Oleksiy Honcharенko. Vlasiuk recalled that the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, in accordance with Trump's executive order dated 30th of June, removed a number of Russian entities from the sanctions list. All of them have been sanctioned for supporting the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The following were removed from the list. So, as for other Russian companies, Global Vision Group, STG Logistic, Maritime Assistance LLC, MB Bank, Syria Imports, Rosoboron Export OAO, Russian Financial Corporation, etc. Designations in the SDN list were adjusted, but US blocking sanctions against them remain in effect. US sanctions against Russia for the war in Ukraine have not been lifted. So one of the big worries here was a Rostec, which is the Russian state-controlled defense manufacturer, has this arm called Rosoboron Export OAO. If sanctions being lifted on that, then, you know, they can just start manufacturing, exporting, and so on and so forth. But the idea is that actually, although these sanctions were lifted from the Syrian point of view, it appears that they still are sanctioned under a separate sanction regime with regard to the Russia-Ukraine war. So MP Honcharенko reminded us that Rosoboron Export in particular had been subject to 3 sanction regimes: Syrian, Iranian and Russian, the latter for the invasion of Ukraine. Trump's executive order removed only the Syrian designation, the others remain in force. And the same applies to the other companies, is a quote. Russian banks also remain blocked. The Syria designation was removed from the SDN, especially designated nationals and blocked persons list, and the SSI sectoral sanctions identifications list, but the Russia and Iran tags were not cancelled, the MP added. So Trump maybe threw the baby out with the bathwater. Journalists noted that he accidentally removed some Russian institutions, banks and individuals from the sanctions list. Along with them was Rosoboron Export, a company that supplies Russian weapons to other countries. So it might not be as bad as one might have thought from the initial reporting there. There's another article on this in the Insider. White House ends Syria-related sanctions on Russian state controller arms exporter, but broader restrictions are still in place. So don't jump to conclusions about that. I know a bunch of people have gone off on one on that, but it has to be emphasized that, as Michael Weiss here says in reference to an article in Foreign Affairs, an excellent essay by Mike Carpenter, note that most of his suggestions are about tightening sanctions and export controls and using frozen Russian assets to help Ukraine pay for its own defences. Policies that those professing themselves terribly concerned about US weapons stockpiles could get behind without raising their anxiety levels. So there are no extra sanctions that have been put on since January the 20th. And you can worry about stockpiles of weapons. If that's a genuine worry, you can go and do something like this instead, and it's not going to affect your weapons stockpiles. Quote from here: even after 3.5 years of full-scale war, Ukraine supporters have not come close to exhausting the sanctions toolkit. If rigorously applied and internationally enforced, the combination of these sanctions enhancements would cripple Russia's economy. So what I've been saying for so long, Trump had the choice when he became president, to go hard on Russia's economy or to go soft. He chose to go soft. If he went hard, Russia would be crippled now, and his, desire for a Nobel Peace Prize could have been realised. As Colby Babwar says of Carpenter, who wrote that article, one of the few Biden administration officials I have positive opinion of. He's obviously correct on this. General Kellogg, the envoy to Ukraine, has repeatedly made the same point on sanctions too. The current regime leaves much to be desired, and the enforcement is even worse. So not only have they not put further sanctions on, they're not enforcing them. The Trump administration could easily increase their leverage over Russia by changing that. 100%. To the point that Republicans against Ukraine state, with reference to New York Times, Republicans against Trump, with reference to New York Times articles, since Trump returned to office in January, the United States has issued no new sanctions against Russia related to the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In some cases, the administration has eased restrictions, and without new ones, analysts say existing measures lose their force. New York Times. Under Biden, the US imposed 170 new sanctions per month on energy, weapons, banking, tech. 170 per month. For 6 months now, under Trump, zero. The pause lets Russia import chips, nav modules, and banking via third countries. Russian importers use new shell companies registered in March and April to reroute US and EU components. These include STM32 microcontrollers found in Orlan drones and Bosch fuel pumps found in Russian military trucks. Between February and May 2025, Russian defense imports from Turkey increased by 38% compared to the same period in 2024. Key goods: ball bearings, radio modules, and drone components. Since January, no new US designations were applied to third country re-exporters. Kazakhstan's top chip exporting firms in Russia in quarter 1 2025, all under 18 months old, remain unlisted and unflagged by OFAC. Multiple suppliers on Ukraine's battlefield tracing list, flagged by NATO and Ukrainian intel, continue to operate with US payment access and shipping insurance. These include firms moving Swiss-made navigation chips through Georgia. In March, US officials identified $2.4 million in Western semiconductors routed to Russia through Armenia. The parts included components previously traced in Shahed drone reverse engineering reports. In May, Kharkiv missile debris included US-made chips from Analog Devices and Texas Instruments, parts sanctioned in 2023. These components were restricted in 2023, but are now reaching Russia again through unmonitored supply chains. The US is not only halting weapons to Ukraine, they are lifting or not enforcing sanctions on Russia to the point that they are starting to be able to operate with impunity in these markets and manufacture weaponry that can kill Ukrainians. And the US is complicit in that. And that's where we are. That's where we're at the moment. It's not a good look for the United States, that's for sure. I'm actually, like I've said this before, I'm actually almost more worried about the sanctions situation. Russia's economy being crippled could end the war the quickest. And if you choose not to do that, you are choosing to have Russia prevail. Thanks for watching. Take care. Speak to you soon.